Manhattan winter. The wind knifed through the avenues, dragging the city's heartbeat into a cold rhythm of ambition and exhaustion. The mirrored glass of Blackwell Global Tower rose like a blade into the gray sky, slicing through the morning mist. From above, the building looked almost alive, pulsing with the restless movement of its thousands of workers, all faceless, all replaceable. Inside on the 12th floor, Annie Lewis was a whisper among storms. Her desk sat in the corner of the risk analysis department, hidden between metal cabinets and the steady hum of servers. She liked it that way, quiet, tucked away, unseen. The others called her polite, efficient, unremarkable. But Annie had built that disguise carefully, layer by layer, until invisibility became her armor. At 27, she had what people called a perfect resume. Harvard scholarship, top of her class. A letter of recommendation from someone who didn't exist anymore. What they didn't see, what they weren't meant to see, was the reason she'd left Boston in the middle of the night 3 years ago and never looked back. Silence was safer than brilliance. Blending in was better than shining too bright. So Annie kept her hair tied. Her words measured, her eyes down. She spoke only when necessary, smiled when expected, and worked harder than anyone else. In the fluorescent glow of cubicles and spreadsheets, she became a ghost with a heartbeat. That morning began like all others. Coffee gone cold before the first sip, numbers flickering on the screen. The air smelled faintly of toner and anxiety. She was reviewing a portfolio, $500 million worth of risky optimism, when the printer next to her jammed again. "Always when I need it, least," she muttered under her breath. The security guard Joe ambled over with his usual grin. "Looks like it hates you personally, Miss Lewis." Annie laughed. A soft, unexpected sound. "Maybe it does. Let me handle it," Joe said, tapping the side of the machine like a doctor checking a pulse. The paper slid out obediently. "There. See? You just need the right touch." Annie's laugh came again, warmer this time. It filled the narrow space between them and lingered, a small thing, yet enough to tilt the morning ever so slightly off its axis. Neither of them noticed the faint red glow of a camera in the ceiling corner. 50 floors above, in an office that seemed carved out of shadow and steel. Charles Blackwell lifted his gaze from the endless stream of reports and numbers on his monitors. He wasn't a man prone to distraction, not by people, not by beauty, not by anything he couldn't control. But the sound, faint, carried through the live security feed on the corner screen, caught him. A laugh. Light. Human. Out of place in this building of silent deals and corporate ruthlessness. Charles's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, adjusting the camera feed. The image sharpened. A woman. Head tilted back slightly, a hand brushing a strand of hair away from her face as she smiled. The light caught her skin, smooth, warm, luminous, against the cold palette of office gray. He didn't recognize her. "How long has she been here?" he asked without looking away. Across the room, his assistant Caleb froze. "Who, sir?" "The woman by the printer. 12th floor. Get me her name." Caleb hesitated. "Sir, the meeting with the board starts in 5 minutes. Her name Caleb." The tone left no room for argument. Caleb moved quickly, tapping on his tablet, pulling up employee logs. "Annie Lewis," he said at last. "Risk analysis. Hired 6 months ago." Charles repeated the name under his breath, tasting it. Annie. He didn't understand it, this pull, sharp and irrational. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was curiosity, yes, but something more layered. A feeling of recognition where there should be none. Charles Blackwell was a man of patterns, not impulses. His empire was built on predicting behavior, markets, investors, people. He could look at a person for 10 seconds and tell if they'd lie, if they'd break, if they'd sell. Yet watching her, he couldn't read her at all. She didn't move like the others. She wasn't vying for attention, wasn't performing competence or seduction. She was simply present, unconcerned with being noticed. And that paradoxically made her impossible to ignore. He turned away from the screen, forcing himself back into the rhythm of business, the ticking clock, the waiting boardroom, the billion-dollar decisions. But her laugh stayed echoing at the edge of thought, irritatingly persistent. Downstairs, Annie tried to shake off the feeling that someone was watching her. It wasn't paranoia, just the instinct of someone who had spent too long hiding. The air in the office felt heavier somehow. She caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of the glass wall eyes, alert lips, curved, faintly posture, too tense. She took a deep breath. "You're fine, Annie. Just another day." But deep down, something shifted. A thread pulled tight between two lives that were never meant to touch. That night, while the city drowned in headlights and winter fog, Charles sat alone in his office. He had dismissed his team hours ago, but the screen still glowed around him. Data analytics, the skeleton of his empire. He clicked the same camera feed again. There she was, packing her bag, shutting down her computer, slipping on her coat. He watched the small gestures, the precision in her movements, the way she checked her phone once, then hesitated before deleting a message draft. No ring, no photos on her desk, no trace of attachment. Charles leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. "She's hiding something," he murmured. "Everyone is." He'd built his life on uncovering secrets, corporate fraud, political leverage, human weakness. Yet he couldn't shake the thought that this woman's secret wasn't one he could use. It was one that might use him. He almost laughed at the idea. Charles Blackwell, billionaire, self-made shark, feeling uneasy because of an employee's smile. Ridiculous. Still, as he poured another glass of bourbon, he found himself whispering, "Who are you? Annie Lewis?" The next morning, Annie woke to a missed call from a blocked number and a strange email from Executive Office subject. Updated departmental review. Mandatory meeting time. 9:00 a.m., floor 52. Her stomach tightened. Floor 52 was the CEO's domain, off limits to everyone except senior executives. She stared at the email finger hovering over the delete key. Probably a mistake. But something in her gut said otherwise. She caught her reflection in the mirror as she dressed a white blouse, navy slacks, hair neatly coiled. Simple, controlled. The uniform of a woman who refused to be seen. Yet for the first time she wondered what would happen if she stopped hiding. At 8:59, she stepped out of the elevator. The air on the 52nd floor was different, colder, quieter, carrying the faint scent of cedar and money. The receptionist's smile was polite, professional. "Ms. Lewis, Mr. Blackwell, will see you now." Her heart stuttered. Blackwell. She followed the assistant through a hallway lined with abstract art, her heels clicking softly against marble. At the end stood a pair of glass doors half open, revealing a man silhouetted against the skyline. Tall, composed. The kind of presence that filled a room even when he didn't move. He turned. For a moment the world narrowed to the space between their eyes. Charles looked exactly like the roomers, tailored precision. A face carved by disciplined gaze like a blade. But there was something else there, something searching. "Ms. Lewis," he said, voice low, calm. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, Mr. Blackwell." She managed forcing steadiness. "Was there something wrong with my report?" Charles smiled faintly. "No, nothing wrong. In fact, it's quite thorough." He studied her, and she felt it, not just the look, but the weight behind it. "I just realized," he continued, "I hadn't met the person responsible for our most accurate risk projections this quarter." Annie blinked. "You called me up here for that?" Charles's lips curved slightly, among other things. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It crackled alive with something unnamed. He took a step closer. "Tell me, Miss Lewis," he said softly, "how does someone that sharp stay so invisible?" Her pulse raced. "Maybe I prefer it that way." "I don't." The words hung between them, electric and dangerous. Then just as quickly, he turned back toward the window. "You can go now. That'll be all." Annie hesitated, confused, then nodded. As she left, she felt his gaze following her like heat against her back. When the elevator doors closed, she exhaled, unaware that somewhere inside the room, Charles Blackwell was still standing, motionless, eyes fixed on the spot where she had been. Outside, snow began to fall over Manhattan, covering the city in white silence. From his office, Charles watched it drift, the reflection of her face still ghosting in the glass. He smiled to himself, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Let's see," he murmured, "how long you can stay hidden. Annie Lewis." And far below on the 12th floor, Annie paused by the window, suddenly cold, sensing something she couldn't name, as if the world had just turned its gaze toward her and would never look away again. Night draped itself over Manhattan like black silk. From the top floor of Blackwell Tower, the city stretched beneath Charles's windows, veins of light threading through darkness, pulsing with money, power, and deceit. It was the kind of view people killed for. He had earned it. He had bled for it, and yet tonight he couldn't see any of it. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, calm, composed, perfectly dressed. Only his eyes betrayed the truth distraction. A laugh, a face, a name he couldn't get out of his head. Annie Lewis. He'd spoken it once that morning just to taste the sound. Soft, balanced, dangerous in its simplicity. And now, as the city sighed beneath him, the echo of her stillness haunted him more than the chaos of his empire. He turned away from the window and walked to his desk, where a thin manila folder waited. Human resources had been efficient as always. Charles didn't like waiting. He sat down, loosened his tie, and opened the file. The photograph came first. An ID badge shot, neutral lighting, expressionless. Yet somehow even that couldn't hide the depth in her gaze. She wasn't beautiful in the way socialites were, no gloss, no artifice, but there was something arresting in the quiet certainty of her eyes. Eyes that didn't beg, eyes that didn't yield. He flipped through the pages. Harvard, summa cum laude, risk analysis, internship at a boutique hedge fund that collapsed mysteriously 2 years ago, employment gap. Then 6 months ago, Blackwell Global. He frowned. No LinkedIn, no public social media, no family listed. Caleb, his assistant, stood nearby, cautious as always. "Some people value privacy, sir." Charles's tone was mild, but his words were a knife. "Privacy doesn't exist in this building. Everyone leaves a trace. Everyone." He studied the file again, more slowly this time, as if it were a riddle waiting to be solved. "She's not hiding from attention," he murmured. "She's hiding from history." Caleb hesitated. "Should I run a deeper check?" Charles looked up, eyes like polished steel. "No, not yet. I don't want to know her secrets from a screen." He paused, lips curving faintly. "I'd rather hear them from her mouth." Hours later, he was still awake. The city's hum had faded to a low whisper, and the only sound in the penthouse was the ticking of a clock too expensive to matter. Charles sat with his glass of scotch, staring at nothing, trying to shake the strange pulse under his skin. He'd spent his entire adult life building walls against risk, against weakness, against anything that made him feel. He'd learned long ago that emotion was the enemy of power. But something about Annie's stillness unsettled him. She wasn't loud. She wasn't ambitious. She didn't try to be noticed. And yet, for reasons he couldn't name, he couldn't stop noticing her. It wasn't lust, not exactly. Lust was easy, predictable, disposable. This was different, an ache, a fascination, a curiosity that felt dangerously close to vulnerability. He laughed quietly at the thought. Vulnerability. The last time he'd allowed that word near him, it had cost him everything. His father's death. His company's first collapse. The betrayal that made him who he was. He had vowed never to feel small again, never to be seen in a way he didn't control. And yet here he was, haunted by a woman who hadn't even looked him in the eye for more than 5 seconds. Across the city on the 12th floor, Annie couldn't sleep either. Her apartment was small but spotless, every surface aligned, every detail chosen to calm her mind. Yet tonight nothing helped. The silence pressed down on her. She replayed that meeting, his voice smooth and low, the weight of his presence. The way he had looked at her as though he already knew something she didn't want him to find. No man had ever looked at her like that. Not like prey exactly, but not like an equal either. As if she were a puzzle meant to be solved. She had seen that look before years ago in another office, another man who thought control was the same as affection. It had ended badly. That was the day she decided to disappear. And now somehow the past was circling again, wearing a different suit and a colder smile. She whispered to the empty room, "Don't get curious, Annie. Curiosity kills women like you." But curiosity was already there, a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. Because even as she feared him, part of her wanted to know what it felt like to be seen by someone like Charles Blackwell, to stand in the path of power and not flinch. Back in his penthouse, Charles opened his laptop. Not to work, just to watch. He pulled up the building's internal camera grid, the same feed he'd seen earlier. It wasn't obsession, he told himself. It was data, observation, research. He found her desk easily. Empty now. A single mug on the corner, half a notebook, one pen, exactly parallel to the edge of the keyboard. Precise, minimal, controlled. He smiled. "You build walls too, don't you, Ms. Lewis?" He leaned back in his chair, imagining her there in the morning, head bent, lips pressed together, that quiet grace that infuriated him with its restraint. He wanted to know what she looked like when the mask cracked, when she stopped pretending not to feel. That thought, dark and intimate, made him tighten his grip on the glass. He had never wanted to break someone open just to see what was inside. Until now. The next day began with a storm. Rain streaked the glass walls of his office, softening the skyline into smudged silver. Charles arrived early as always. His meetings blurred together, boardrooms, numbers, handshakes. But behind every conversation, her face hovered. He caught himself scanning the floor directory when he didn't mean to. He dismissed 3 calls. He didn't eat. When the day finally ended, he gave an order he hadn't planned to give. Send Annie Lewis the new risk models for review, personally. Tell her to bring them up here tomorrow. Caleb looked surprised. "You want her to?" "Yes." Charles's tone left no room for argument. "I want to see how she works, alone." He didn't mention that he wanted to see how she reacted to his presence, his questions, his silence. To him. That night, alone again in the quiet of his office, Charles allowed himself to imagine the next day. The elevator doors opening, her scent something faint and clean like rain, her eyes lifting to meet his, cautious but unafraid. He wondered what she would say if she knew the man waiting for her, wasn't sure whether he wanted to understand her or consume her. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "We start tomorrow." Annie woke before dawn, heart uneasy, though she couldn't say why. A strange email blinked in her inbox, a direct assignment from the CEO's office. She was to deliver the revised risk model in person to Mr. Blackwell. Her hand stilled over the keyboard. Once could be coincidence. Twice was deliberate. She remembered the way he had looked at her yesterday, measured, quiet, dangerous. There was something predatory about that calm, as if he already knew she'd come. Annie exhaled slowly, telling herself she could handle it. He was just a man. A powerful one, yes, but still a man. And she had survived worse. Still, when she dressed that morning, she chose a darker blouse, tied her hair higher, and dabbed perfume she hadn't worn in years. Not to impress him, she told herself, but to remind herself that she was not invisible anymore. She wasn't sure whether that thought terrified or thrilled her. As night fell again over the city, Charles stood at his window once more, Manhattan glowing below like circuitry. He didn't feel the fatigue that usually came with endless days. He felt anticipation, sharp electric. He'd read her file, memorized every word. But paper didn't tell you how someone breathed. Tomorrow he'd find out. Caleb stopped by his office on the way out. "Anything else before I go, sir?" Charles didn't look up from the city. "Yes. Make sure the 12th floor knows I expect Ms. Lewis at 9 sharp. No interruptions." Caleb hesitated. "Sir, may I ask why she interests you?" Charles turned then, and his smile was both charming and terrifying. "Because she doesn't try to." Outside, the storm returned rain drumming softly against the glass. He raised his glass to the skyline, a silent toast to the inevitable. "She thinks she can hide in plain sight," he murmured. "Let's see how long before she looks back." The city flickered. Somewhere far below, Annie turned off her light, unaware that tomorrow, when she stepped into the elevator to the 52nd floor, her life and his would never move in silence again. The elevator hummed softly as it climbed 12 floors, 20, 30, 40. Each number that flickered felt heavier than the last. By the time it reached 52, Annie's pulse had turned into a rhythm she couldn't slow. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored doors, poised, calm, immaculate. But she could feel it, the tremor beneath the surface, that familiar ache of stepping into a room where you didn't belong. Except this time, it wasn't fear that made her hands tremble. It was curiosity. The doors slid open. Silence greeted her, thick, deliberate, expensive. The air smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Ahead, floor-to-ceiling glass stretched across the room, and a man stood before it like a shadow carved from the city itself. Charles Blackwell. He didn't turn right away. He simply stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other resting against the window as Manhattan bled gold and silver beneath the morning sun. The world outside looked small from here, fragile, like something he could crush if he wished. "Mr. Blackwell, Blackwell. Her voice was soft but clear. He turned then. In that moment, the world seemed to contract, air thinning, distance vanishing. His eyes, pale gray, cut through the dim light, studying her, not as an employee, not even as a woman, but as something he couldn't quite define. Ms. Lewis. Her name in his mouth sounded different, lower, almost reverent. "Come in." Annie crossed the threshold, careful to keep her steps steady. The carpet muted every sound. Her fingers tightened around the folders she carried, the printed report that had dragged her into his orbit. "You asked for the risk model revision," she said, placing it on his desk. "It's complete." "I leave it there," Charles interrupted quietly. "We'll get to that later." The words didn't sound like an order, yet they left no room for refusal. She looked up. His gaze didn't move from her face. He circled the desk slowly. His presence filling the room, the way smoke fills a closed space, unseen but impossible to escape. "You've been here 6 months," he said. "And somehow I didn't notice you until yesterday." He tilted his head slightly, voice softening. "How does someone like you manage to disappear in plain sight?" Annie's throat tightened. "I don't try to be noticed, sir. I just do my job." A faint smile touched his lips. "That's the problem, Ms. Lewis. You're too good at it." He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could smell him, something dark and clean like whiskey and cold air, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, even though he wasn't touching her. Her instinct told her to step back. Her curiosity told her not to. So she stood still. "I looked at your work," he continued. "Numbers precise, forecasts nearly flawless. But there's something in them, something almost emotional." She blinked. "Emotional patterns aren't just math," he said. "They're people trying not to make mistakes. You see that, don't you? You see fear in numbers?" Annie didn't answer. He was right. That was how she'd survived reading risk not from equations, but from the tremors underneath them. Charles smiled as if he'd confirmed a theory. That's what I wanted to see. The mind behind the data. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, then softly, "You can relax, Ms. Lewis. I don't bite. I don't scare easily," she lied. He chuckled under his breath. "Good. I'd hate for you to run before we've even started." The air between them shifted, less professional, more charged. She tried to move toward the door to create distance, but his voice stopped her. "Tell me something," he said. "What makes you laugh?" The question caught her off guard. "Excuse me, yesterday," he said. "You were laughing with the security guard." "What did he say?" Annie felt the blood drain from her face. "He was just fixing the printer." Charles stepped closer. "And that was funny enough to make you smile like that." "That's none of your business," she said, her tone sharper now. For the first time, his expression shifted, not anger, but intrigue. "There it is," he murmured. "A spark. Mr. Blackwell." "Charles," he corrected quietly. "Say it." Her breath caught. "That's not appropriate." "Maybe not," he said, voice dropping lower, "but it's honest." He reached out fingertips, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The touch was barely there, light as breath, but it sent a jolt through her veins, something primal and undeniable. Every instinct screamed at her to step away. Instead, she froze. Charles studied her reaction like a scientist studying flame. He wasn't smiling anymore. His gaze had turned unreadable, a storm behind glass. "Why do you hide it?" he asked softly. "Hide what?" that he said, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw. "That expression that makes the world stop for a second." "The one you just gave me now?" Her voice trembled, though she tried to steady it. "You shouldn't talk to me like this." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I don't believe in should and shouldn't." He stepped back at last, giving her room to breathe. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until it left her in a rush. "Do you always test people like this?" she asked quietly. "Only the ones I can't predict," he said. "And you, Ms. Lewis, you're an equation I haven't solved yet." Annie gathered the folder from his desk, her fingers unsteady. "If that's all, I'll be going." "Not yet." She froze. Charles walked to the window again, but his reflection in the glass watched her still. "You intrigue me," he said. "That's rare. Most people bore me within 5 minutes. I'm not here to entertain you." He turned his gaze softer now, almost contemplative. "No, you're not." A pause. "But you make me curious. And I don't like being curious." Annie swallowed. "Then maybe stop looking." A shadow of a smile crossed his face. "I tried." He walked toward her once more, stopping close enough that the world seemed to blur around them. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you know what curiosity does to men like me, Annie?" She shook her head slowly. "It turns into obsession." The words hung in the air, heavy, electric, honest. For the briefest moment, neither of them moved. Then Charles stepped aside, clearing the path to the door. "You can go," he said softly. "For now." She left without another word, the sound of her heels echoing against the marble floor. In the elevator, her chest rose and fell too fast, her hand gripping the folder like a shield. The city came into view as the doors slid shut, the skyline slicing through the fog. She didn't see Charles standing where she'd left him, eyes fixed on the elevator's reflection, jaw tight. He hadn't meant to lose control, not even for a moment. But when she'd looked at him with that mixture of defiance and fear, something inside him had cracked open. He'd built his empire on control. Now one woman had undone it with silence. He poured himself a drink, watching the snow begin to fall again over Manhattan. Somewhere below, she was walking away, believing the encounter was over. But it wasn't. He could still feel the ghost of that single touch between his fingers, soft, electric, forbidden. And he knew, with absolute certainty, this was only the beginning. By the next morning, everyone at Blackwell Global knew. Rumors like wildfire have a way of finding oxygen in silence. No one asked questions, no one dared. But the whispers crawled through glass walls and marble corridors. Charles Blackwell had chosen her. On paper, Annie Lewis was promoted to Special Executive Assistant to the CEO, a title that sounded both ordinary and radioactive. In reality, it was an unspoken decree. She now lived inside the lion's den. Her new office was adjacent to his, separated only by a wall of frosted glass that wasn't as opaque as it seemed. Through the blur, she could sense him, his movements, his stillness. When he spoke on the phone, his low voice carried through the partition like a current. When he fell silent, she could feel that silence pressing against her skin. The first morning, he didn't greet her, didn't look up when she entered his domain. He just said, "Sit." So she did. And when she started typing, she felt his eyes on her, not openly, but in the pauses between keystrokes. Every word she wrote became a heartbeat, every breath a betrayal. Charles sat behind his desk, fingers interlocked, pretending to read a report. But he wasn't reading. He was listening to the rhythm of her typing, the small hitch in her breath when she felt him watching. He'd brought her here because he wanted proximity. That was the lie he told himself. The truth was darker. He wanted to see what control looked like when it began to slip. "Your analysis on the volatility model," he said at last, "was flawless." "Thank you, sir." "You can drop the sir." She hesitated. "Mr. Blackwell, then." He looked up, eyes locking with hers. "That's worse." Her hands froze on the keyboard. "You'll have to settle for it anyway." That earned him a quiet smile from her, small, unintentional, but real. And something inside him shifted, sharp and immediate, like the click of a safety coming off. Hours blurred. He moved around her, calculated, silent, studying how she worked, how she avoided meeting his gaze for too long, how her lips pressed together when she focused. Every time she tucked a curl behind her ear, he had to remind himself to breathe. When she asked for clarification on a report, he leaned over her shoulder, close enough to feel her body tense beneath his shadow. Her perfume, something faintly floral, almost shy, stirred the air between them. "You're too careful," he murmured. "It's called professionalism," she replied. "It's called fear." She turned to face him, then defiance sparking. "And what exactly do you think I'm afraid of?" His answer came without hesitation. "Me." The room went still. Annie's pulse thudded painfully in her chest. He was too close, too honest. But the worst part wasn't the proximity, it was that he wasn't wrong. He leaned down, voice low enough to graze her ear. "I don't mean in the way you think," he said. "Fear isn't always about danger. Sometimes it's about recognition." Her breath caught. Recognition of what? He smiled, a quiet, knowing curve of his lips, that what you feel might destroy you. She rose from her chair, needing distance, but he didn't move. When she brushed past him, her shoulder grazed his chest, soft contact, electric enough to steal the air from both of them. That evening, a private board meeting was scheduled in the CEO's conference suite, a room drenched in gold light and secrets. Annie stood at the projector organizing documents, aware of his presence behind her. The other executives were late, and in the hush between them, tension thrummed like a wire pulled too tight. Charles approached the sound of his shoes, deliberate, unhurried. "Are you nervous, Gnome?" "Liar?" She turned, meeting his gaze squarely. "Why am I really here, Mr. Blackwell?" He stopped a step behind her, his voice almost gentle. "Because I wanted to see how close I could stand before you stopped pretending." His breath brushed her nape, warm, deliberate. Her spine straightened, but she didn't move away. "You shouldn't do that," she whispered. "Do what blur lines." He chuckled softly, the sound dark and amused. "Lines only exist until someone crosses them." The door opened. Executives poured in, laughter and false confidence filling the room. Charles stepped back instantly, his expression smooth, detached. To everyone else, he was the picture of composure. But under the polished veneer, he could still feel the ghost of her skin against his breath. The meeting began. Annie kept her eyes on the charts, her voice steady as she presented figures worth billions. But under the table, her hand trembled once, and his gaze flickered to it like instinct. Without thinking, he reached under the table. His fingers brushed hers. A silent touch. Hidden. Measured. She froze. The contact was brief, barely a second, but it set the entire room spinning. No one saw. No one would ever know. Yet both of them did. She didn't pull away, not immediately, and that was what undid him. When the meeting ended, the executives left oblivious. Charles stayed seated, watching her pack the documents. The air between them was still vibrating with what had just happened. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Annie." She hesitated. "Do you know what people call this office?" he asked. She shook her head. "They call it the Devil's Office." He smiled faintly. "They think I built it so I could watch the world burn below my feet." He rose, walking toward her, his tone quiet. "But I think maybe I built it to trap myself." Her throat tightened. "Then maybe you should leave it once in a while." He studied her for a long moment. "Maybe I just need the right reason." She swallowed hard, then turned away. "Good night, Mr. Blackwell." After she left, Charles stood alone in the golden half-light, the city stretching endlessly below. He pressed his palms against the cool glass eyes, unfocused. She was getting under his skin. Not like others before, temporary distractions easily forgotten, but like a fracture forming beneath armor he'd spent years perfecting. In the reflection, he could see her figure disappearing down the hall. And in that reflection, for the first time in his life, Charles Blackwell looked like a man afraid, not of losing control, but of what he might do if he stopped trying to keep it. Meanwhile, in the elevator, Annie closed her eyes and exhaled. Her hands were still trembling, though she didn't know if it was from anger, fear, or something more dangerous. She told herself it was a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment. But deep down, she knew better. Something had shifted in that room. Something irreversible. That night, neither of them slept. Above the city, two souls stared at the same skyline from different windows, each wondering if the other felt the same unbearable pull. And though neither spoke it aloud, they both understood what had just begun. Inside the Devil's Office would not end there. The city was asleep, but Blackwell Tower never truly went dark. It stood like a sentinel over Manhattan. Its upper floors still pulsing faintly with light, the reflection of power that refused to rest. And in the heart of it, behind glass and shadow, Charles Blackwell sat alone. Rain poured down the windows, streaking the skyline into silver veins. He poured himself a drink, bourbon, neat and stared through the glass until his reflection blurred into the storm. The city, his empire, looked small from here. Everything did. Everything except her. A soft knock broke the silence. He didn't turn. "Come in," he said, voice low, detached. The door opened with a whisper. "Mr. Blackwell." Even before she spoke, he knew. He could recognize Annie's voice anywhere. Now the calm beneath the uncertainty, the steady rhythm that had begun haunting his nights. She stepped inside, her coat damp from the rain. "I was finishing the quarterly projections," she said. "The courier needed your signature before midnight." Charles gestured toward the desk. "Leave it." She placed the folder down carefully. He watched the way her fingers moved, the faint tremor she tried to hide. He waited until she turned to leave before he spoke. "Annie." She paused. "Yes." His reflection in the window tilted toward her. "Do you know why I keep you here so late?" Her pulse stumbled. "Because you don't sleep." He smiled faintly. "That's one reason." The silence stretched heavy, deliberate. Outside, thunder rolled over the skyline. Finally, she said, "If this is about the report, It's not about the report," Charles cut in quietly. He turned then slowly, like a decision he'd been resisting. For a moment, he just looked at her. Not the way a man looks at a woman, but the way a storm studies the shore before it hits. "Do you know," he began, "why I noticed you?" Annie's throat tightened. "I don't think that's relevant." "It is to me." He took a step closer. "Because you didn't want to be noticed." His voice was low, almost reverent. "Do you have any idea what that does to a man who's spent his entire life being watched?" She said nothing. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was defense, the kind that comes from knowing one wrong word could unravel everything. He exhaled the sound, almost a laugh. "You hide so well, Annie. You move through this place like a secret I was never meant to find." Then his tone darkened. "And that drives me insane." He closed the distance between them, stopping just a breath away. The air shifted, charged electric. Annie's heartbeat thundered against her ribs. She forced her voice steady. "Mr. Blackwell, this, whatever this is, needs to stop." "Charles," he corrected softly. "Don't." "Say it," he murmured. "I can't." He smiled, though his eyes burned. "You already have?" "Just not out loud." She took a step back, but he followed, measured, patient. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because I can't not." He reached up, fingers brushing the air near her face, but never quite touching. "I've spent years chasing numbers, power, control," he said. "Everything that could make a man feel untouchable. And then you walk in quiet, invisible, and suddenly I'm the one who can't breathe." "Charles." "I fired someone today," he said abruptly. Her eyes narrowed. "What?" He glanced toward the rain-smeared glass. "A man from security. The one who fixed the printer for you." Annie froze. "Joe." "You fired Joe." His gaze returned to hers. "He made you laugh." It was said so calmly it almost didn't register as madness. But when it did, the shock hit like cold water. Her voice was sharp now. "You can't do that." "I already did." "Why?" He took a slow sip of bourbon. "Because I didn't like the way he looked at you." She stared at him, disbelief turning into anger. "You can't control who smiles at me." "Can't I? Jesus, you're—" She stopped herself. "You're out of line." He set the glass down, the sound sharp against the silence. "No, Annie. I'm just honest." He moved closer, and this time he didn't stop. His hand rose, hesitant, trembling, only once, before his fingers touched her chin. "Look at me," he whispered. Her breath hitched. "Don't." But she did. Up close, he wasn't the legend everyone whispered about. He was just a man, flawed, exhausted, burning. The power that terrified others was now something raw, almost human. "You think I'm sick?" he said quietly. "You think this is some twisted game, isn't it?" He shook his head. "No, it's worse than that." His thumb traced a line along her jaw, slow, reverent. "I'm addicted to you." Annie's voice was barely a whisper. "That's not love. I didn't say it was." His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes. "Love is clean, safe. Whatever this is hunger, need. And I don't know how to stop." She felt the room tilt. Her instinct screamed to run, but something inside her refused. "You can't keep doing this," she said, her voice shaking now. "You can't keep pulling me into whatever you're fighting inside your head." He smiled faintly. "I'm not fighting it anymore." Then came the silence, the kind that hummed louder than sound. Outside, lightning flashed, painting their faces in blue-white light. Annie stepped back, forcing space between them. "You can fire whoever you want, Charles. You can control everything in this city, but not me." He looked at her, then really looked, and something in his expression shifted. The arrogance cracked. The predator hesitated. For a fleeting second, she saw the man behind the legend, lonely, desperate, terrified of being powerless. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe that's why I can't stop looking at you." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Go, before I say something I can't take back." She hesitated, her hand trembling on the handle. "What do you want from me, Charles?" He turned away back toward the window, his reflection swallowed by rain. "Everything," he whispered, "and nothing you're willing to give." Annie left without another word. The elevator doors closed behind her with a hiss sealing off the storm. Inside the office, Charles stood motionless, jaw tight, hand still burning from where he'd touched her. He hated himself for it, for losing the one thing he'd always worshipped: control. But beneath the self-loathing was something worse. Desire. He pressed his forehead against the glass, watching the city blur. Down there, she was walking into the night, unaware that every drop of rain carried his name. He whispered it once, just to the storm. "Annie." And somewhere below, in the quiet of a waiting cab, Annie whispered it back, though she didn't know why. The rain swallowed the sound, but it was already too late. Neither of them realized it yet, but a confession had been made, and there would be no turning back. Rain hammered the glass like applause from some unseen god. Outside Manhattan blazed neon veins, cutting through the storm reflections, trembling on wet asphalt. Inside Blackwell Tower, the world held its breath. Annie stood in the doorway of his office, chest rising too fast, soaked from the downpour. She hadn't meant to come back. She told herself it was work, that she'd forgotten something, anything but the truth. But the truth waited for her the moment Charles looked up. He was there as always, behind his desk, the skyline spilling gold and thunder around him. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, collar undone, the mask of the immaculate CEO stripped away. For once, he didn't look untouchable. He looked dangerous. "Annie," he said, her name a sigh more than a word. She should have turned around, but she didn't. Something in his voice pulled her in, magnetic, inevitable. The distance between them dissolved one step at a time. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "I could say the same to you." He rose from his chair. The light caught his face, sharp planes, tired eyes, an expression that was both confession and command. Annie tried to keep her tone steady. "This is wrong. I know." He moved closer. "But tell me you don't feel it." Her lips parted, but no words came. The air between them felt alive, trembling. Lightning flashed through the glass, outlining them in white fire. "Charles." He stopped inches away. You keep saying my name like it's a warning. It is. He smiled faintly. Then warn me again. And she didn't. It happened before thought, before reason. He reached for her, and the world fractured. The first touch was heat, immediate, consuming. His hand at her jaw, her breath caught between them, the rain outside beating faster. Then his mouth found hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't patient. It was hunger. It was surrender. It was everything he'd been holding back, finally breaking through. Annie's hands rose instinctively, first to push him away, then, against every rational instinct, to pull him closer. The kiss deepened, darkened, became something that wasn't about affection, but claiming. He kissed her like he wanted to erase the space between skin and soul. When she finally broke away, they were both breathless. Her voice trembled. "This isn't who I am." Charles's eyes burned. "It's exactly who you are. You've just forgotten." She shook her head, stepping back, though her body still leaned toward him. "You think this is passion? It's chaos." He followed, quiet but relentless. "Maybe chaos is all that's real." Annie's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. "You think you can own everything, even this?" "No." His voice cracked. "This owns me." That stopped her. He took another step, slow, deliberate, until her back hit the glass wall overlooking the city. Rain streaked down behind her, a mirror of the tears she didn't realize had gathered in her eyes. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "But I can't let you go. You already have. Then why are you still here?" The truth hovered between them, unspoken but alive. Because she wanted him. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. Because danger in his arms felt like recognition. He reached out again, and this time she didn't move away. His hand found the back of her neck, his thumb brushing the pulse beneath her skin. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. Annie met his gaze. "You wouldn't. Try me." She didn't. Their mouths collided again, less wild, more desperate. The taste of bourbon and rain, the heat of his breath against her throat, the soft sound she made when he pressed her closer. It all blurred into something that felt like falling and burning at once. His jacket hit the floor. Her hands clutched his shirt, fingers curling into fabric as though she could anchor herself in the storm. Outside, thunder rolled echoing through the glass. He pulled back just enough to look at her. His voice was hoarse. "You don't understand, Annie. You're not just what I want." She tried to speak, but he shook his head. "You're the only thing that makes me feel alive." Her breath caught. The words shouldn't have meant anything. But they did. Because she could hear the truth in them, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the man beneath the empire who had everything except peace. Something inside her broke then. Not in pain, but in surrender. She pressed her forehead against his, her voice barely a whisper. "This will destroy us." He smiled, bitter and tender all at once. "Then let it." They stumbled together through the office shadows and light tangling around them. His hands traced the line of her spine. Hers brushed the roughness of his jaw. Every touch was a confession neither could speak out loud. And when he kissed her again, slow, deliberate, reverent, it wasn't conquest anymore. It was ache. It was truth. The rain outside blurred the skyline into liquid gold, reflecting the fire that now lived between them. When it ended, they stood there in silence, the sound of the storm filling the space their words couldn't. Annie's lips were swollen, her breath uneven. Charles looked at her like a man who'd just watched the world end and didn't regret it. "This never happened," she whispered. He nodded once, but his eyes betrayed him. "Whatever you say." She turned to leave. Her hand lingered on the door handle. You don't get to save me, she said softly. And I won't save you. He exhaled a sound halfway between a laugh and a confession. Then what are we doing? She looked back at him, rainlight glinting in her eyes. Burning, she said. Then she was gone. Charles stood alone again, chest heaving, staring at the place where she'd been. The scent of her still clung to the air, jasmine and storm. He picked up his glass, but didn't drink. Somewhere deep inside, beneath all the control and calculation, a single realization bloomed like flame. He had finally found the one thing he couldn't own, and he would destroy himself at trying. Outside, the rain turned to fire in the city's reflection. Above it all, in the devil's office, the storm raged on. The morning after Manhattan woke hungry for scandal. Every headline carried the same photo: Charles Blackwell immaculate in a dark suit, his hand closing around Annie Lewis's as they stepped out of the elevator. The image was a spark, and the city eager for fire burned. Who is she? The caption screamed. The mysterious woman behind the empire. The fall of the untouchable Blackwell. By noon, the world had chosen its story. Annie watched it unfold from her small apartment, the television flickering across her face. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't open: colleagues, strangers, journalists. Some were cruel, some curious, some obscene. They all asked the same question. Who are you? The woman in the reflection barely looked like herself anymore. Somehow, overnight, she'd become a myth, a scandal wrapped in designer gossip. And beneath that myth, her real life was crumbling. When the call finally came from Charles's office, she didn't hesitate. She needed answers. The top floor was chaos disguised as order. Assistants whispering, lawyers pacing, investors demanding. The company's stock had dropped 3% by mid-afternoon. Every camera in the world was pointed at the Blackwell building. But Charles. He stood calm at the center of the storm, sleeves rolled tie, gone the corner of his mouth, almost amused. When she entered, the noise around him seemed to dim. Close the door, he said. She did. Then she turned, voice sharp with fury. You told them. He looked at her like she'd just asked if rain was wet. Of course I did. Charles. They were going to find out anyway, he said, leaning back against the desk. So I gave them the story before they could write their own. She stared at him, disbelief mixing with anger. You called a press conference. He nodded once. This morning. What did you say? He smiled faintly, eyes unreadable. I said you weren't an employee. You were the woman I chose. The words hit her like a physical blow. Chose, she repeated. You made me sound like a possession. That's how this world understands things, he said simply. Ownership, territory, narrative. I control the story, or it controls me. Her voice trembled. You don't get to control mine. He straightened his calm, slipping for the first time. I'm trying to protect you, Annie. By putting me on every front page, yes. His tone sharpened. Because now no one touches what belongs to me. The word hung between them like the crack of a whip. She stepped back, eyes flashing. Don't ever say that again. His jaw clenched. You don't understand how this works. Then explain it. He hesitated, then sighed, almost weary. Power isn't clean. You can't reason with it. You either own the story or you become its victim. And what am I now? She asked quietly. He didn't answer. By evening, the backlash had already begun. Paparazzi outside her building. Whispers in the hallways of Blackwell Global. Women glaring, men smirking, security guards pretending not to look too long. Her inbox overflowed with threats. Anonymous messages, vile, jealous, invasive. Someone had sent a photo of her apartment door. Another, a single line. He can't protect you forever. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, the city below alive with lights and lies. When her phone buzzed again, it was him. "Charles? Don't leave the apartment. I'll handle it." She typed back, "Handle what?" But the message went unread. The next morning, he was waiting outside her building. Black car, dark coat, expression carved from control. "Get in," he said. "I can't just get in, Annie." She did. Inside, silence wrapped around them, broken only by the sound of tires slicing through rain. Finally, she said, "What are you doing?" "Fixing what I broke. By hiding me, by keeping you alive." She turned sharply. "What does that mean?" He met her eyes, the calm gone now, replaced by something far more dangerous. "Someone's been following you." Her stomach dropped. What anonymous threats traced through proxy servers? Same language, same signature patterns. They're connected to one of my rivals, Richard Hale. She shook her head. "You think one of your enemies would come after me?" Charles's voice was cold steel. "They won't touch me, Annie. So they'll touch you instead." She leaned back, the weight of his words sinking in. "And what are you going to do?" He looked out the window. "Whatever I have to." That night, the story deepened. News outlets reported Blackwell's mistress under threat. Stock prices wavered. A rival CEO hinted at moral instability at the top. The vultures had found their feast. But Charles didn't flinch. He called a second press conference. Standing before the cameras, he said, calm and deliberate, "The world seems fascinated with who Annie Lewis is. Let me clarify, she is not my scandal. She is my choice. And anyone who harms her will regret it." The room erupted. Flashbulbs, shouts, chaos. But his eyes found her across the crowd, steady, unyielding, a promise hidden behind threat. That night in his office, she confronted him again. "Do you realize what you've done? You just painted a target on my back." He stood by the window, rain streaking down the glass. "I warned them what would happen if they tried." "You don't own the world, Charles." He turned then, his gaze sharp. "Don't I?" She exhaled shakily. "This isn't power anymore. This is obsession." He walked closer, stopping just short of touching her. "Maybe," he said softly, "but obsession is the only honest thing left in my world." Annie's voice broke. "You're playing a dangerous game." He smiled faintly. "No, Annie, we are." Outside, Manhattan glittered with secrets. Inside, two people stood at the center of the storm, bound by choice, by ruin, by fire that refused to die. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the glass, a camera clicked. The next move had already begun. The night was too still. Even the city, loud, sleepless Manhattan, seemed to hold its breath outside the towering glass of the Blackwell penthouse. Rain slid down the windows in thin silver lines, whispering against the glass like secrets too soft to hear. Annie couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the couch. Charles's jacket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the lights below fade into the mist. He had gone to the study hours ago, still buried in phone calls, still pretending the world hadn't turned against them. But beneath the calm, she could feel it, something dark moving in the quiet. The kind of silence that comes before disaster. Then came the sound. Not loud, but wrong. A crack, sharp and brittle. Glass. She froze. "Charles," she called softly. No answer. A second sound, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Her pulse spiked, the air tightening in her chest. She stood, heart hammering, and turned toward the study just as the door burst open. A man stepped through the shadows, his face half-hidden, gun raised. And then Charles was there. It happened in a blur, his voice shouting her name, the gunfire, the smell of metal and rain. The sound tore through the penthouse, through her bones. She felt herself shoved backward, hitting the floor hard. And when she looked up, Charles was on his knees, blood spreading through the white of his shirt like a crimson flower. Charles. Her scream ripped through the air as she crawled to him. He was still upright, one hand braced against the floor, the other clutching his shoulder where the bullet had hit. Behind him, the intruder fled into the storm shouts, alarms, chaos. But Annie only saw Charles. He turned his head toward her face, pale eyes steady. "Don't," he said through clenched teeth. "Don't touch the phone. You're bleeding, I don't care." His voice was low, ragged. "Look at me." She did, tears blurring her vision. "I told you," he said, blood dripping down his arm. "I don't let anyone touch what's mine." The words should have angered her. They didn't. They broke her instead. "Stop talking like that," she whispered, pressing her hands over the wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. "You need help?" He caught her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "You're shaking." "Of course I'm shaking. You've been shot." He smiled faintly, the expression haunting. "Then we're even. You've been killing me for weeks. Charles, please." But he leaned closer, his breath warm despite the blood, his voice soft enough to shatter her. "Don't be afraid, Annie. I've still got too much to live for." She bit back a sob, her forehead pressing against his. "You idiot," she whispered. "You could have died." "I told you," he murmured, eyes closing. "Not before you." Then he went still. The next few hours blurred into sirens and white light. Security swarmed the penthouse. The shooter was gone. Paramedics shouted orders. Her hands were still red when they pulled her back. She tried to follow, but someone stopped her. Caleb Charles's aide, his face drawn and pale. "They'll take care of him," he said, though his own voice was shaking. She could still hear the sound of his heart from where she'd pressed her palms against him. That steady rhythm. That promise. "Don't be afraid. I've still got too much to live for." The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sleeplessness. She sat in the hallway outside the surgical unit, hands clasped, blood drying beneath her nails. It wasn't until dawn that the doctor came out. "He's alive," the man said simply. "The bullet missed the artery. He'll need time, but he's strong." The world exhaled. Annie's knees went weak. She sank into the nearest chair, hands covering her face. For the first time since the shot, she allowed herself to cry, not out of fear, but relief so fierce it hurt. When she finally gathered herself, she went inside. The room was dim lit only by the slow pulse of machines. Charles lay motionless, his skin pale against the sheets, but his chest rose evenly. For a moment she just stood there, afraid to break the fragile quiet. Then she whispered, "You should have let me take the bullet." A soft sound came from the bed, a rough laugh. "I'd never forgive myself," he murmured without opening his eyes. She moved closer, her voice trembling. "You're supposed to be sleeping. I don't sleep when you cry," he said. Her throat closed. "You almost died. But I didn't. You think that makes this okay?" His eyes opened, then gray, glassy, alive. "No. But it means I get another chance to tell you what I should have said before." She shook her head. "Don't. I have to." His voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like a vow. "I don't know what this is between us. It's not clean, it's not easy. But it's real, and I'd take a bullet for it again." Tears welled in her eyes. "Charles?" He smiled faintly. "You called me by my name." She almost laughed through the ache. "Don't make this about your ego." He closed his eyes again, exhaustion pulling at him, but his hand reached for hers. "You saved me. You're the one who jumped in front of a gun." Same thing he whispered. Hours passed in quiet fragments. The storm outside finally broke into sunlight. The city resumed its usual rhythm, money greed headlines, but inside that hospital room, time held still. Annie sat by his side, fingers tracing the pulse at his wrist, counting each beat like a prayer. She thought of the man everyone feared, the ruthless CEO, the predator in a tailored suit, and couldn't reconcile him with the man who had shielded her with his own body. He wasn't untouchable. He wasn't invincible. He was just human. And that terrified her more than anything, because now she couldn't pretend she didn't love him. When he finally slept, she stood walking to the window. The city glowed below, washed clean by rain. For the first time, she understood the cost of standing next to someone like Charles Blackwell. He was a man built on danger and devotion, power and ruin. Loving him meant living in the space between them, between blood and promise. She turned back to him, whispering the words she couldn't say when he was awake. "You're not allowed to die before me. That's the rule." Then quieter still, "And I don't know how to stop loving you." Hours later, he stirred again, eyes half open, voice hoarse. "Still here?" She smiled faintly through tears. "Where else would I be?" His fingers brushed hers, weak but certain. "You're shaking again. So are you." He laughed softly. "Then we'll shake together." She leaned closer, pressing a hand to his chest, feeling the steady thrum beneath her palm. "You said you still have something to live for," she whispered. "What did you mean?" His eyes met hers, clear now, unguarded. "You," he said. And in that single word, Annie knew there was no going back. The night outside the hospital was sleepless again. Rain pressed against the glass, relentless as memory. In room 702, the monitors hummed softly, their rhythm steady proof that Charles Blackwell still lived. But peace had not returned with him. It began the moment Annie left his side. A call, a question, and then the world shifted once more. Two men in gray suits appeared at her door that morning, federal investigators, polite but sharp-eyed. They asked for Ms. Annie Lewis. They showed her the badge and the warrant. She felt her lungs tighten as they spoke the words she had prayed never to hear again. "There are discrepancies in your employment record, ma'am. We'd like you to come with us for a few questions." It was polite, professional, but she could see it in their eyes. They already knew. For 10 years, Annie had buried her past beneath new names, new jobs, new silences. She had believed she'd outrun it, the scandal, the trial, the stain of a crime she didn't commit, but had been part of anyway. A fraud that had destroyed lives. A betrayal that had ended one. Harold Blackwell, Charles's father. She hadn't known then. She hadn't known the man she worked for, the man she loved, was his son. Not until she'd seen the old photo on his desk, the same face she'd seen once in a courtroom a decade ago, framed by headlines she could never forget. When the agents left, she sat motionless, the air thick around her. The truth was a living thing crawling out of the grave she'd made for it. By evening, the news had already broken. Blackwell CEO, linked to ex-convict in decade-old financial scandal. Her face again this time, not as the mysterious lover, but the liar. And though she was innocent of intent, guilt hung around her like smoke. Charles woke to silence. Caleb was standing near the window phone in hand, face pale. "Tell me," Charles said. Caleb hesitated. "It's Annie." The name hit like a blade. Charles sat up, ignoring the pull of stitches in his shoulder. "What about her?" Caleb handed him the tablet. The headline glared back, cruel and bold. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. The room was so still, even the heart monitor seemed to hold its breath. Then he whispered. She knew Caleb swallowed. "It looks that way." "Get out," Charles said softly. "Sir, I said get out." When the door closed, Charles stared at the article until the words blurred. It felt like falling without movement, like the ground had been pulled from beneath him. His father's face flashed through memory, stern, proud, destroyed. The betrayal that had broken him. the fraud that had stolen everything. And now, her. The woman who had become his weakness, his pulse, his undoing, carrying the shadow of the very man who'd taken his father's life. He pressed his hand against the wound in his shoulder, feeling it throb hot and alive. For the first time, he didn't know if the pain came from the bullet or the truth. That night, the door opened again. He didn't look up. Annie stood there pale and silent, her hands trembling though she tried to hide it. He could smell the rain on her coat, the same scent that used to mean home. Now it only smelled like distance. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was calm, too calm. "I had to come. Did you?" She took a step closer. "They're saying things, half-truths, lies. Half-truths," he repeated, a bitter smile curling his mouth. "So which half is true, Annie?" Her throat closed. All of it. And none of it. He finally looked at her then. She wished he hadn't. His eyes were no longer fire, they were ice. "Start talking," he said. She told him everything, her voice steady at first, then breaking. About the firm she had worked for at 22, the man she trusted. The forged signatures, the shell accounts. How she'd been the one to process the transfer she didn't understand until it was too late. The money that vanished. The lawsuit that followed. And the name, Harold Blackwell. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Not until the news. Not until they showed me the photo. And then you came to work for me." "It wasn't planned," she said. "I didn't even apply directly. They placed me through a recruiter. I swear I didn't know who you were until when?" She hesitated. "Until after the first time you said my name." Silence. Long, suffocating. Finally, Charles exhaled, his voice low. "So this is how the universe works? The son falls for the daughter of the man who ruined him." Her tears spilled before she could stop them. "I never meant," he cut her off gently. "Stop saying you didn't mean it. You were there." She nodded, breaking. "Yes, I was there. And I've been paying for it ever since." He looked away, the weight of history pressing between them. Outside, thunder rolled over the skyline, slow and heavy. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Tell me the truth, Annie. Did you come to me to make it right? To atone?" She met his eyes through tears. "I came to forget." "And did you?" "No." Her voice trembled. "Because I found you instead." He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. The war inside him was visible, the hatred, the hurt, the love that refused to die. Then slowly, he reached for her hand. "Maybe this is how we balance it," he said softly. "Pain for pain, debt for debt." She stared at him, disbelieving. "What are you saying?" He opened his eyes again, gray, steady, burning. "I'm saying stay," he whispered. "If you came to make it right, then do it. Not with guilt, with love." Her breath caught. "Charles, stay," he said again, firmer now. "Stay and prove that not everything born in blood has to end in it." She pressed her forehead to his tears falling freely now. "I don't deserve forgiveness." "I didn't ask you to deserve it," he murmured. "I asked you to give it meaning." He lifted her chin, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Maybe my father died because of what you were part of," he said quietly. "But if I let this destroy us, then I die too. And I've already done that once." Outside, dawn broke over Manhattan, soft light spilling across the glass. Inside the hospital room, two people sat in the wreckage of truth and found something stronger than forgiveness. Resolve, because love, when born from ruin, is not gentle. It is survival. And as Charles's hand tightened around hers, Annie understood they were no longer just fighting the world. They were fighting fate itself. 6 weeks later, the city held its breath again. The ballroom at the Metropolitan Grand shimmered beneath 1,000 lights, cameras flashing like lightning. Reporters lined the marble steps, microphones aimed toward the stage where Charles Blackwell stood, pale but unbroken, a strip of white bandage visible beneath the collar of his suit. Beside him, Annie Lewis, composed, still, her hand in his trembling only once. The crowd quieted when he raised the microphone. 6 weeks ago, Charles began, voice steady but edged with exhaustion. I nearly lost my life. Flashbulbs exploded. He waited for the noise to die. Tonight I stand here because someone refused to let me die. He turned toward Annie. She didn't flinch, though every eye in the room followed the movement. The world has called her a liar, he said. A manipulator. A gold digger. A ripple of whispers. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that had terrified Wall Street for a decade. But I call her something else, the woman who saved me. Twice. Cameras flashed again, brighter now, relentless. The crowd wanted blood or confession. He gave them both, wrapped in poetry and truth. I built an empire. Charles continued on control, on fear, on the illusion that power could keep me safe. He glanced at the crowd, at the investors and vultures who once worshipped him. But the truth is, I was never safe, not until she walked into my life. A low murmur spread. Reporters scribbled faster. Charles's voice softened. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me was losing control. Turns out the worst thing was never having something or someone worth losing. And then in front of the world, he reached into his pocket. Gasps. The cameras froze on him, on the small velvet box in his hand. Annie's breath caught. Charles, she whispered, barely audible through the microphones. He went down on one knee. The room erupted into chaos, flashes, screams, disbelief. But Charles looked only at her. Annie Lewis, he said softly, voice breaking under the weight of everything unsaid. I've lived in darkness all my life, the kind built from glass towers and golden lies. You were the first person who didn't bow to it. You didn't want my power. You wanted the man buried beneath it. He opened the box. The diamond caught the light, not extravagant, but pure. Marry me, he said, and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you were never invisible. The air fractured with noise, but all she heard was her heartbeat. She wanted to run, to breathe, to believe. Her hands shook as she covered her mouth. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. Charles, she whispered, you don't have to do this for me. He looked up, eyes steady. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because I finally can, because I'm no longer afraid of being seen. The crowd leaned in. She could feel the weight of the city on her shoulders, every camera, every whisper, every judgment. But for once, none of it mattered. She knelt down in front of him, took his shaking hand, and said quietly, so only he could hear, I was never meant to be seen. But if you're standing with me, maybe I can learn how. He smiled, then something raw and unguarded breaking through. Then say yes. She nodded, tears glinting in the flashlights. Yes, she whispered, yes. Applause thundered. The press lost its mind. Outside, the city roared with noise and disbelief. But in that moment, none of it touched them. He slid the ring onto her finger, hands trembling, and for the first time in years, Charles Blackwell looked human. Not a king, not a monster, just a man who'd found something worth kneeling for. Later that night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the glittering chaos of New York, Annie leaned into him. Below them, the city pulsed alive, endless, merciless. But for once, she didn't feel small. I used to disappear in crowds, she murmured. Now they all see me. He smiled, resting his forehead against hers. Let them look, he whispered. They'll never touch you. She laughed softly through the tears. You sound like a threat." He kissed her hair. "No," he said. "A promise." And beneath the starlit skyline, under the eyes of a city that had once chewed them alive, the invisible girl and the man who ruled the world stood hand in hand, not hiding, not running, finally seen, finally free.